Hello, Alex. Thank you for coming on to be my guest.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Okay, so we've done lots of topics here in the show. And we are 50 plus episodes in. And today's episode is not necessarily the most happy podcast topic, but it is very important, I think, to cover. And we're talking about divorce in real estate. Um, let's just start by saying that it's pretty much understood that about 50% of marriages do end in divorce, which is, unfortunate depending on how you look at the marriage and, in general. But it's certainly not a fun process to go through a divorce. I have met very few people who have like enjoyed it or had like 100% positive experience. And I think one of the stressors that really comes in play when you own a house or you own any property together is how do you deal with that? Um, Home is, having a home, having a roof over your head is a basic need, right? So we're not talking about splitting of like, the candelabra that you have in the dining room, but we're talking right now, today, we're talking about your homes. So thank you for coming on and helping kind of break some of this down for people who are maybe considering a divorce, starting a divorce, so that they feel a little bit more comfortable with the process.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, it is a difficult issue. It usually is one of the hot button issues in going through separation and divorce. And so I'm happy to give the insight I can.
Yeah. So, I mean, maybe you can just start by telling people why you went into this. I think it helps to build a little bit of trust here so people understand kind of what you do and why you do it.
Sure. So I got into the practice of family law, almost 15 years ago. I've been practicing in the Washington, D.C. metro area for 13 years. I started out doing a lot of criminal defense work and decided early on in my career that you know criminal defense was rewarding, but that sometimes you were seeing people that maybe had done something bad and maybe weren't the best people, but they were putting on a front and trying to be better people maybe than they were. And doing family law, you tend to see in divorce work, you tend to see generally pretty good people, but at their worst. And so I decided that it would allow me to, help, everyday people going through some tough times, and it's a rewarding experience. And so that's why I've been doing it. And
Yeah. I mean, I
yeah,
always wonder, just as an aside, how attorneys decide what kind of law to practice. I mean, we live in DC. I
sure,
feel like everybody has a JD. Well, it's everyone either has a JD or is a real estate agent. So it's always
that's
interesting
right,
to hear how people went
right.
into what they do. Okay, well, before we really get into some of the specific questions, I thought it would be great for us to cover just general pieces of advice to help you get through your divorce and things to do and things to not do, because people are at heightened places, right? Even in the best of situations where you amicably decide you want to get a divorce, it's inevitable that things are going to come up, that people are not on the same side of things, right? So let's just talk about some like generalities. And I'll start with one so it doesn't sound like you're plugging yourself, but don't think that you can do this on your own. I really think that people need to talk to somebody who knows what they're talking about, in this case, an attorney like yourself. It's like I liken it to not going to WebMD to diagnose yourself with an issue, because you go to WebMD and you think you're going to die if you read anything. And if you read, you know, LegalZoom maybe, or just like blogs and things like that, you are going to maybe leave being horrified by what may or may not happen. So my number one is to make sure that you are hiring somebody to help you through the process. Do
Super
you?
important, super important. I mean, legal Zoom and things. I mean, there are things on the internet that actually create more problems than not having something done legally in the first place, and trying to get you out of a circumstance where you thought you were doing the right thing, and all of a sudden you've waived certain rights, and you've waived support, or you've waived the rights to the court handling your issues because you just didn't know what you were doing and you were trying to save a buck, and it ends up costing you a lot more. So super important.
Yeah, it's the older I get, I feel like the more I really buy into the whole like pay it up front and then it'll help you in
Mm-hmm.
the back end, which is, I think at some point, I think people kind of flip, you're young, you don't have money, you're thinking about saving it, but at the end of the day, if you invest in somebody helping you, that probably almost definitely is going to help you in the long run. So,
Absolutely.
and we're not even talking about stress and whatnot. So helping somebody through that process so that there's less stress on you is also a massive benefit.
Yeah.
Um, okay, so another thing to not do is
Yeah, I
listen.
got one. Don't
Yeah.
don't listen to your gossiping friends, right? Or, I have my aunt who's a lawyer in Ohio, and she told me this. Well, we appreciate all the support that because clients do need support, right? You need support when you're going through this. It's traumatic. It's like a trauma. So having family support is huge, but you don't want to listen to the friends that think they know it all, right? That went through a divorce on their own and have their own views. While it's helpful to know that people care about you, it also can create problems. Nobody's case is the same, right? So everybody has their own circumstances. They've got their own situation financially. They've got their own situation with their kids. Their kids have their own needs. Their houses are different, right? There's no two. I mean, there's no circumstance that is identical, and so um, to the extent that you're spending more time listening to your friends and what you should and shouldn't be doing versus listening to your lawyer, I think is something that can create more problems.
I mean, I'm sitting here and smiling only because I say the literal exact same thing about real estate, right? It's like people have
Hmm.
had vastly different experiences. And if you're talking to anybody outside of the DC, Maryland, Virginia area, I don't care who's in it, or, who's done real estate there. Like it's just a different beast. Yeah. So I mean, I say the same thing and I totally get it. You want to make sure, I mean, sprinkle in if you want a little bit of people's, experiences, but there are just so many different ways that these, if we're going to call it transaction for you too, that these transactions can go. So, you're never going to anticipate every single, nuance that can happen with these situations. Okay, so another one I have, only because I went through selling a friend's home while going through a divorce, is that one of the parties was basically avoiding their lawyer, and it really held up the situation. So, I mean, we could talk about this in the context of real estate or just in generality, like, or just in general with having getting a divorce. Is don't avoid your lawyer. You if you're going through the process and you probably just want to get it done as seamlessly and easily as possible. But yeah, I'm sure you have a little bit more experience with
Yeah,
that.
I mean, we with the caveat that understanding it's an emotional process, right? And a lot of people they avoid, right? They know that it's traumatic and it's difficult, and they don't want to have to go through it. So it is a completely normal human response to not want to face it head on. But if you avoid your lawyer, it's going to cause not just more problems, but let's say we're talking about real estate and you need to get the house on the market. But before you can get the house on the market, you need to get an agreement with your lawyer about how those proceeds are going to be divided or escrowed or something. And you delay. And like, let's look at this housing market, right? So, I mean, you could speak more to the volatility, but we do have clients that they were trying to negotiate something in the spring regarding their homes, and usually we're talking about a house sale. Now, how much money has that family lost because somebody didn't want to focus and get things done? Um, Also people don't realize that like, yes, you're paying for your lawyer's time, and so that may be another reason why you're not communicating with them. But the closer you get to trial, so if you've got a hearing or a trial date, the more work the lawyer is having to do. There are deadlines, like court required deadlines, and lawyers don't like to go to court unprepared. So what does that mean? That means they're spending actually more time preparing a case for trial because they're getting closer and closer. We usually tell clients like once you're 60 days before your trial date, the fees are going to start escalating because of witness preparation and depositions and binders and all kinds of stuff. So if you're communicating with your lawyer early on about how to reach a resolution, you're hopefully never coming anywhere close to that, and you're going to end up saving money. So yes, are you spending more time on the phone with your lawyer, maybe more meetings with your lawyer early on? Are you paying for that? Sure. But are you then having to pay for all the trial preparation work, which is, 3, 4 times that? No, you're avoiding it. So absolutely don't avoid your lawyer. I mean, you've hired them for a reason. You need to stick with it until, things get resolved the way that they need to be.
Right, like assuming people listen to our number one piece of advice, which is to hire somebody, then just remember you did that for a reason. That's
Right.
a good rule of thumb, I think.
Sure.
Okay. Anything else that you think people should avoid?
The only other thing I think is it's just easier said than done, but just don't panic, right? Like you're going to get through this. Like you said, I think you gave a stat of 50%. Maybe be more than that now. Um, you want to make sure that you understand that people are going through this and people are getting out on the other end and they're moving on with their lives. And it is difficult and it is traumatic, and we get that. But the more you panic and create more, stress and anxiety on yourself, the harder it's going to be. I mean, take a breath. We'll get you through it. And again, I understand that it's easier said than done when you're in the thick of it. But yes, I'd say that don't panic is something that I would absolutely suggest.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's fair. I say the same things about real estate, it's all gonna work out at some point.
Right.
Okay, so in talking about things not to do, we've kind of talked about things to do, right? Like, so don't research it on yourself. So obviously a good one would be to hire an attorney. But are there any other things that people should definitely focus on doing while they're going through this process that we haven't talked about?
Yeah, I mean, just a couple things that come to mind are you want to make sure that you're getting a strategy early on,
Hold
right?
on, hold on, Alex. It's happening with your headphones. So let's stop and we'll come back. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Come back.
All right, I'll be right back. So just a couple things that I think are important. Um, get a strategy and get a strategy early. Um, it's really important that when you're hiring your lawyer, they're coming up with a process for you so you can follow it, so that you just don't feel like this is something that's going to continue to go on and on and on. Implement that strategy. Part of that strategy, almost all times, are to gather documents. So do that early. You can even start doing that before you hire counsel. Um, that can include in the real estate HUD documents, right? So closing documents, things regarding the purchase of the property. That's going to be really important. When we're talking about tracing out assets to the extent that there's something inherited or brought into the marriage, going back and looking at what those documents might be. So if there was a house that was purchased and you owned before the marriage and you sold it sometime during the marriage, which is a very common scenario, you want to try to go back and gather those as early as possible, because your lawyer is going to need them. And so if you start obtaining that early on in the process, it's going to be better. It's also important that as you're gathering that information, you might be moving out. The documents might be in the marital home. So
Mhm.
you want to make sure that you get that stuff before you potentially get blocked out of it. We've had a lot of cases where people are saying, "Oh no, I had all this money, or I had this house, or I had these closing documents, but they're in the marital home." And then when they go back, they've magically disappeared. So you want to make sure that you're covering yourself by gathering that information. And then the last thing I would suggest is to really put your family and your kids first, right? I mean, this again is a difficult process, but the more that you can remember that you're doing it hopefully for the betterment of your family, whether that's with or without kids, right? You're doing it for your well-being, and so to put that first above anything.
Yeah, and a quick comment about the documents. I have had a number of clients who don't even know where things are located because it wasn't like their job, right? Like we've got roles and responsibilities that we take on often in relationships. Some people handle doing the dishes and other people do this, but it very often comes down to paying bills and dealing with paperwork and things like that. So it might feel counterintuitive right when you get married to have a discussion about where important documents are and whatnot. Maybe unromantic, people might say, but it's just reality for you to kind of know where those things are, so that you can, I mean, again, I don't think a lot of people go into marriage being like, okay, well, maybe we'll get divorced. Like, I hope a lot of people don't do that, but just knowing that like life can happen and that you may need to, just like also if somebody like passes away. We did an episode on, when people pass away, what you need for real estate in that case. Like just understanding where all of those things are is really important. So we can just kind
Absolutely.
of leave it at that.
Yeah.
Okay, so now that we've kind of spoken in some generalities, and we have to, of course, say that you practice law in Virginia and DC, and some of our listeners are in Maryland. So, all of the stuff we just talked about obviously will apply to all three jurisdictions, and maybe some that we're talking about now would, generally apply to all three. But we are just, mainly focusing on DC and Virginia today. Um, and yeah, so, and also I want to say that this is exceptionally nuanced. Um, we're going to try to give some general answers to the most common questions that I put together that somebody going through a divorce I think would ask. But to the earlier point that we made about hiring an attorney, he or she can really break down where things lie for you and your personal situation. All right. So without further ado, I will get started with my questions, Alex. Okay, so how is a home calculated in a divorce?
Good question. So I think the the clearest answer is however the parties want it to be valued. I think the most common approach is that the parties get an appraisal, and they're using a slightly different methodology than getting a home appraised for financing purposes or for home purchasing. And most of those appraisals that are done for home purchasing or refinancing don't necessarily carry the same weight as if you're in court and you're getting an appraisal for purposes of divorce. But that is the most clear-cut answer is you get the home appraised. There are circumstances where parties can agree to do something different. So a lot of times we'll have clients that'll come in and say, me and my spouse agree that the house is worth $1.2 million, and that's what we're going to use. And that's fine. And there's no requirement under either Virginia or DC law that you get a home appraised. But when we're trying to figure out the actual value for the property and there's a dispute or the parties maybe aren't seeing eye to eye, then an appraisal is the way that it's going to happen.
I mean, I assume once you put the onus on somebody outside of the two parties getting a divorce, that probably just makes things a little bit easier. It's hard to refute a professional's assessment of your house versus something you agreed upon at some point during the process. So that makes sense. Okay, so how do you advise people on keeping versus selling a home during a divorce? I think this is a big one. This is one that comes
Yeah,
up for me a lot.
it is. And I'm going to just like your caveat about I do practice in Virginia in a firm in the Washington, D.C. area. I'm also not a financial advisor. So typically the strategy we employ is we utilize financial advisors to help us make those decisions, but a lot of it will depend on the intricacies of your situation, right? So, are you able to financially afford that property on your own? Is there going to be spousal support that's going to be awarded to you, or that you're going to have to pay, which might change your expenses and your income? Are you going to qualify for a refinance?
Hmm.
Are you going to be able to maintain the monthly carrying costs and potentially have to buy the other person out of that?
Hmm.
Are there kids involved? The kids need to stay in the same school district. Does that school district have other housing options that are more affordable? So it really is an analysis that we have to do with you based on your situation. But it's one that I mean is in almost every situation involving separation and divorce where parties are having to figure out what's the right next step, and we need to balance all those different considerations. If you can afford it, and it's easier for your family and for transitions, then we would love to figure out a way for you to buy out your spouse of the property, and that's something that we do all the time. If it doesn't make sense, then we want to make sure that we're we're doing everything we can to get the house on the market with the right realtor, with the right experience, who's going to be able to get a deal done as quickly as possible with for the most money, so that you can figure out what the next step is in your housing future. So it's a very is renting an option. That's another possibility.
Hmm.
Again, there's potential tax consequences associated with that, right? So if you're going to move over to renting the property and you've gained a lot of wealth and equity in the property, or you have to pay taxes on the back end. And that doesn't mean we can't work out a deal that takes that into consideration. So if you're going to rent that out, maybe we have to reduce the value of the property that's appraised by the potential capital gains when it's sold because you're going to rent it. So I mean, these are all things that can be addressed as part of your separation and divorce. But it is definitely a complicated issue and one that a lot of people struggle with.
Yeah, and a lot of it again, it's like this with all of our industries, but it starts to bleed into different industries like financial planning, and that's really important in this particular kind of bullet point that we're talking about here. And I say that a lot about tax accountants. People are asking me tax implication questions for real estate because they're obviously very important to the process, but that's not the lane I drive in, if you will. So understanding also, I'm working with somebody who's going to tell you this is the time you should talk to XYZ person. I can give you broad kind of general understanding of something, but you should be talking to that person instead. Okay, so let's say one person does stay in a house, but they're both on the mortgage. What happens then? What happens to the mortgage after a divorce?
Yeah, so typically what happens is one party's going to have to purchase out the other's interest, and that will include refinancing the liability on the property.
Hmm.
So that's where, again, when we're trying to figure out whether you're going to buy out the other person's interest or have to sell the property, are you going to qualify for that refinance? So, it's not just about what the house is worth; it's about what the debt is on the property, and
Hmm.
you're going to have to qualify. Assumptions are not easy, right? A lot of mortgage companies won't do assumptions, and so you're going to potentially have to refinance with a new rate, and go through that whole process. And so
Hmm.
you want to make sure that you don't want to go through this, negotiate your way to where I get to buy, and you have your heart set that you're going to buy your spouse out of the house, and then find out that you can't qualify for that to occur because whether you're going to court or it's in an agreement, if you've got to take somebody off the liability and you can't, you're going to have to sell that house either way. And so it's an important thing you gotta make sure you know the answer to.
Sure, sure. Okay, so this one actually is another of the most common questions I have. So, what does it matter if if a spouse owned a home before the marriage? Like, so we're talking about like deeds, jointly deeded versus not.
Hmm.
I'm assuming it does
Yeah,
matter.
it does. It definitely does matter, and I'm going to caveat this again with like it depends on whether we're talking about Virginia versus DC, and Maryland's got its own rules as well. Um, separate property though is typically viewed as property that's owned before the marriage, right? So house owned before the marriage is typically going to be classified initially as separate property. There are different rules, and so you want to make sure and we could spend an hour on how to deal with tracing in all the different jurisdictions. Um, but this is where gathering documents is important, so we can try to
Mhm.
figure out at the outset a strategy for you. But yes, I mean it does matter if something was done before the marriage, whether his money was put into the property during the marriage, whether the property was sold and a new asset was purchased or a new house is going to change all these different allocations of whether it's separate or marital or hybrid. And so we're going to, again, ask you to consult with somebody who's going to give you the specific details, but that does matter. In Virginia, in particular, the title of the property at the time of the divorce trial is also very important. So one thing that people don't realize is that in Virginia, if you own a house and it's only in one person's name, it's not in joint names, the other person who's not on the deed cannot have a judge order the property to them. So, and that's sometimes alarming, right? So couples married for 20 years and they've been living in the house, but it's only in the husband's name, and the wife wants to stay there and buy out the husband's interest because they've got 3 kids together and they all go to a good school there. And while they're free to make an agreement to that effect, if it goes all the way to court, a judge in most cases does not have the ability to transfer the property to the wife. They can give her money for the equity, they can order it sold, but they can't give it to her. So, again, different jurisdictions have different rules, right? DC is a little bit different on that front, but it is important. So, the deed of how the property is titled at the outset is also an important consideration.
Okay, I'm sorry we have to leave and come back again because your headphones are doing it, but we'll come back and then we'll
Okay,
do like literally 2 more minutes. Okay,
sure.
bye.
Thanks.
See you in a
Thank you.
minute. Okay, so fun for you, Alex. So let's say we're going through this, the process has started. What does somebody do if one of the two parties is not being compliant or doing what they should be doing or being asked to do in the midst of this process?
Yeah, and it happens a lot, especially if somebody's not happy with the circumstance and they're out to get the other person. Um, so one thing we usually recommend. So if you contact your lawyer usually has certain remedies that they can exercise. One of them is to bring what's called a rule to show cause or a compliance hearing, where they're basically asking the judge to find that the other spouse is not being in compliance, whether that's they're not cooperating with signing, real estate documents, they're not signing the listing agreement, they're not agreeing to let the repair workers in, they're not signing the closing documents. And there's usually some pretty serious penalties that come when you bring those types of hearings, attorney's fees, fines. Judges have the power to put people in jail if they're not compliant. So, again, going back to sort of the things to do, I mean, communicate with your lawyer about that. You don't want to find that, there was a delay of 30 or 60 days that could have been avoided. Usually all it takes is a lawyer stepping in and either notifying the opposing lawyer or communicating directly with the spouse that if this continues, here's what's going to happen. And it's usually going to be much more costly to the non compliant person. And so you can usually get things moving pretty quickly. So, again, I think there's a lot of value in just keeping your lawyer in the loop, especially you're bringing them in to help resolve your divorce. Usually, your house is one of your bigger assets. Don't forget to follow up with them. A lot of times we've got clients that are signing an agreement, they're getting divorced, and then we don't find out for 6 months that somebody wasn't being cooperative, and now there's been a lot of lost time. So make sure that you're keeping them in the fold.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you for coming on. Like I said, I think this is a topic that can be very overwhelming at the very least for people. So having a place to start, something to listen to or watch is certainly helpful. I will be linking your information on the show notes. So if anybody wants to get in touch with you or if they want to, reach out to me to put you guys in touch, I'm happy to do it. And yeah, thanks again. Maybe we'll have you on for a follow up.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay, bye.